As someone returning to Warhammer Fantasy after just over a decade, I've set myself a project to get an army assembled and painted ready for a first game of Age of Sigmar this summer at Warhammer World. These are the chronicles of that project, and this week I want to talk about the second edition rules and see just how streamlined they are when compared to the old Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So, the second edition rules are available for free download ahead of the official release this weekend. I have my big box set on advanced order, which should arrive on Monday because, Games Workshop are incapable of delivering on Saturdays. So whilst planning out my Skaven army, I've been reading up on rules for the second edition Age of Sigmar this past week. One thing I have noticed keeps being said of Age of Sigmar compared to Warhammer Fantasy Battle is that the rules are streamlined. This either means that the game is simpler to play or that the rules are easier to follow. Comparing the Age of Sigmar pamphlet with the latest edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle that I bought, which was the 7th edition, you could be forgiven for thinking the game is a lot simpler. However, much of the bulk of the old Fantasy Battle rulebook was fluff, a larger font, lots of images, very clear explanations of the rules, and a number of scenarios used to illustrate how the rule was to be used. In contrast, the Age of Sigmar rules are very concise, use only limited examples and diagrams, though do also have some rules apparently removed. In Fantasy Battles you had rules like hatred, frenzy and stupidity. These are not in the Age of Sigmar rules. However, that's because they transplanted those sorts of rules directly into the war scrolls of individual units. So although the game rules are lighter, the rules for units have more to them than was the case for Fantasy Battle. So it's really just a case of moving some of the rules elsewhere. Just on that point, I do think that it's a major improvement that basic rules and unit rules are available free of charge for download. Just buying the models and the equipment needed to assemble and paint them makes any form of Warhammer game a potentially expensive one. It doesn't help that much of the cost is front-loaded because of that equipment, but there isn't much of a way to avoid that. But by at least knocking off the cost of rules and army books, the game is more accessible. In addition, the new push-fit models sound like a great way for someone to get a box set of models, which is always way cheaper than the individual costs of those models, and can get games up and running without lots of expensive kit, if you want to start off playing games with unpainted models, which is fine for beginners. So if I were talking about accessibility, there's no doubt that Games Workshop have come up trumps here. Now, those free rules don't include the rules you need for match play, which is all I'm interested in. But they are at least available in a separate book which does need purchasing. This is fine, though I gather it wasn't available at the launch of the original game, which is a little bit baffling. One slightly odd feature, however, is the unit pricing. In fact, there are two odd features. One, you don't have a points per model in Age of Sigmar. You buy multiples of the minimum unit size, it seems. For example, 10 Plague Monks cost 70 points. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that one of my units would be 19 strong, which someone commented that I'd be wasting some points, and they were right. I can't pay for 19 models. I can pay for 20 models and field 19, but I'm still paying for 20. And two, you get a discount on many units at 40 models, so it costs 70 points for 10 Plague Monks, 140 for 20 and so on. But it costs 240 points for 40 models, not the 280 you'd expect. This means that the game encourages you to get fewer, more massive units of grunts. This is surely a hassle when moving in a game where all units skirmish. Still, let's get onto the game itself and see how it will flow. This is from someone who hasn't played a game yet, bear in mind. Now, the start of the turn incorporates traditional start of turn events and magic. Magic has certainly been streamlined, but I'm not sure in a good way. It used to be the case that your wizards chose an appropriate deck and then randomly rolled a number of spells based on their level. The random nature of the selection was not always welcome, but the range of options was. Now, wizards just get a small selection which is known in advance. However, the real loss of strategy is in the lack of power and dispel dice. Now, there is no deciding how many power dice to use for the caster or how many dispel dice to risk for the defender. There's still a choice as to which spells to cast and where, but it occurs to me that magic is a lesser force now. Maybe that's why it doesn't get its own phase anymore. Next is the movement phase, and this is most certainly not streamlined. In fact, it seems to be much more convoluted. The only awkward part of movement in Fantasy Battle was with difficult terrain. Everything else was straightforward. If you wanted to move at full tilt, then you marched, which was double your movement. If you were too close to an enemy unit, then you couldn't do this, but could either move normally or charge if in range. If you declared a charge but it turned out you were out of range, you just moved your normal movement towards them. Now there are multiple movements in multiple phases, and that's not even considering that technically each model needs moving individually. Even moving across an obstacle is more complicated, even though there are at least some rules for that now, which were absent in the first edition of Age of Sigmar. The other thing is that a lot of the movement you will do will be determined by the roll of a die. In other words, how far you can move in a whole turn is determined partially by your movement value and partially by dice rolls. That makes it very difficult to foresee how far and in which directions your units will be moving, even though you have in your head where you would like them to move. The important thing is to make sure that each model ends the phase within a certain range of the other models. If not, then it's split and you will end up losing models as slain. This encourages you to clump them all up, but I was thinking this might be a problem against template shooting attacks, but they are no more, it seems. So if there's no disadvantage in clumping units up, it would not only make them easier to move, but also provide a smaller front to be charged by multiple enemy units. At this point, I wonder why they ever removed regiments. This aspect of the game could actually make turns take longer. Skirmish games don't really favour lots of models, and I'm now concerned that 2K games might be hard to come across. Still, that's all hearsay until I try it out, so time will tell. The shooting phase has definitely been streamlined and, I might add, improved. So as I said, there seem to be no template attacks. In Fantasy Battle, these could be a real drag as you had to position the template and work out how many models were fully under and how many were partially under. If it just clipped the corner for base, did you count that, for example? It was a constant battle between trying to maximise your opponent's casualties and not being an arse about it. Now, however, shooting is just based on ranged and hits. If you're in range, you roll to hit. If you hit, you resolve with wounds and saves as appropriate. The shooting phase will definitely be quicker and the rules are simpler to follow. So now we have another movement phase. There's a separate phase to make charges on enemy units. The charge distance is randomised, meaning that fast and slow units alike have the same charge distance unless their war scroll gives them a special bonus. This again throws your strategy into the hands of fate and less on judgment and forethought. The only real judgment you can apply is to know that on average you'll be able to move up to 7 inches on a 2d6 roll. Still, there doesn't seem to be many consequences for a failed charge as you just don't move at all. In Fantasy Battle, a failed charge had you moving towards the intended target, albeit a shorter distance. But this could put you in harm's way of a counterattack. In Age of Sigmar, there's no difference in your position. The only real consequence might be if you had a choice of 2 units to charge and failed the declared unit but could have made the other. Like shooting, combat has also been partially streamlined. In Fantasy Battle, you made rolls to hit, wound and save just as with Age of Sigmar. However, your rolls to hit were determined by comparing your weapon skill with your opponents on a hit table. Similarly, wounding was determined by comparing strength with toughness. Granted, veteran players didn't read the tables as it was a simple enough system to remember, but it was an extra bit of admin. In Age of Sigmar, your units just have set rolls to hit and wound. It makes no difference whether you are attacking a brick wall or a whirling dervish. Save rolls may still be modified by the rend value of attacks, which seems to be the same as armor piercing. So I said that the combat has been partially streamlined. That's because it's been made quicker and easier to understand in the hitting and wounding. But it's been made more protracted in another way. In Fantasy Battle, models could attack enemy models that were in base contact. In Age of Sigmar, you have a range, which generally seems to be about 1 or 2 inches depending on weapons equipped. This makes for an awful lot of range measures to quite a lot of models potentially. This could drag the combat phase out quite a bit, especially with the 2-inch range weapons. For example, I will have a unit of Plague Monks with have 2 weapons. One has a range of 1 inch and the other 2 inches. I'm hoping that once I get a few games under my belt with experience and the range tool that comes with the box set I'll be getting, it can become a quicker process. However, you can only speed it up so much because your opponent also needs to see that the range is there, at least when playing with someone you don't know well. Oh, and then there's movement in this phase too. If any units are within 3 inches of enemies in the combat phase, they make a pile-in move to bring them in combat range. I think this is just because you might only get a few models into combat range after a charge, and it's a way of getting many more into the fray. But still, yet another phase where movement happens. Finally, tests are made for any units which suffered casualties. This is a modified roll against their bravery. They are what used to be called leadership tests. It's quite funny really. You used to take leadership tests against your leadership value. Now you take Battleshock tests against your bravery value. Not really sure how that's streamlining. Couldn't they just call it the bravery phase and bravery tests? Still, never mind. One good thing here is that the fail tests don't force units to flee. The last thing we need here is another phase of movement. Instead, you just lose a number of wounds equal to the points you lost the test by. This is all much simpler and much more satisfactory. A definite improvement on Fantasy Battle system of flight and pursuit, I'd say. And I'm not just saying that because I like Skaven. So in terms of streamlining, I'd say that on balance, Age of Sigmar isn't. The relatively few pages of the rules are mostly explained by the fact that there is massively more brevity. No scenarios used by way of explanation. Many of the rules are simply farmed out to the war scrolls, and many of the rules for match play, which was an integral part of Fantasy Battle, are found in a beefier rulebook in the form of the General's Handbook. There are some aspects which are definitely streamlined. However, this is checked by the extra fiddliness of the movement and combat range rules. All issues I might add which arise as a direct result of large units of models being skirmish. If we had the regiments and small skirmish units of Fantasy Battle, then Age of Sigmar could have been genuinely streamlined. I am still looking forward to playing, however. I still think it will be a hugely enjoyable game. I just think there are some flaws in the system. I'm not really sure why they wanted to go the skirmish route. I'm also thinking that after I've had time to raise a few armies, that the ones I end up playing the most are more likely to be the armies of elite troops rather than hordes, to reduce the number of models I have to shift around the battlefield. One last thing for those who've been following the series. I had mentioned that I neglected to get some silver paints, and so the Plague Monk blades would have been left for a few weeks, as Games Workshop are, as I said at the start, incapable of arranging for Saturday deliveries. Well, someone recommended Goblin Gaming, and I ordered some paints, more Plague Monks, and also a battle mat. I paid for Saturday delivery and then was rather surprised to get an email yesterday that it would be arriving Thursday. Well, in most parts of the UK, Thursday isn't Saturday. Maybe in Cornwall. Also, there is only one reason why people would pay for a Saturday delivery, and that's because they aren't in on other days. There's just something about tabletop gaming companies, it seems. In a world where the high street is dying and direct-to-home deliveries are the present, never mind the future, I do worry for companies who still seem to be decades behind on this sort of thing. Still, I think I've sorted it and they should now be delivering on Saturday when I can get my hands on the paints for the blades. Next week I'll be opening up the Age of Sigmar Soul Wars box and getting my first read of a General's Handbook. I'll cover that and give an update on my Plague Monks. 2 more weeks and I'm off for 6 weeks. After that you'll see much more rapid progress and some battle reports. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, please like, subscribe and share with others who may also be interested. Comments are always nice too. And until next Thursday, I'll see you later.